900 years ago, a noble ideal flamed in the hearts of a small group of men and women in a distant land, in the middle of conflict and war. They sought to bring hope and comfort to the sick and the poor, and to defend their faith. Their example stirred others from all nations to join their ranks. Over the centuries, they would be hailed as heroes and despised as fanatics. At times, they would fall victim to war, politics, and even their own humanity, and their light would waver. But in the end, their example would forge a commitment in the hearts of their followers that would endure the test of time and establish forever the name of the Knights of St. John. 1,000 years ago, Christians, Jews, and Muslims mingled in the sacred city of Jerusalem. By custom and agreement, they respected each other's faith and shared the holy sites. The world east of the Mediterranean Sea was about to explode in a conflict for land and power that would continue for centuries. Muslim Turks were sweeping out of Asia, threatening everything from Arab North Africa to the Aegean Sea. It was the beginning of a struggle between Arabs, Turks, and even the Mongol hordes for control of the Islamic world, and the winds of war were rising. Fearful of the future, the Orthodox Christian Church of Constantinople, being the closest to the conflict, looked to Europe for help. For many years, the rising power of the Muslim Turks had threatened the pilgrimage routes to the Holy Land. And so, the First Crusade was born. The response was more than the Pope or Constantinople could have hoped for. In 1095, tens of thousands of men across Europe took the cross, dedicating their swords and their lives to the liberation of the Holy Land. They headed for the ancient land of Palestine, where in 1099 they captured their goal, Jerusalem. But within its walls they discovered an oasis of peace that amazed them: the Hospital of St. John the Baptist. The date of its founding is uncertain, and no one knows who built it, although the merchants of Amalfi, Italy, are often credited. It was led by one brother Gerard, and it served the sick and poor, regardless of their race or their faith. Wounded crusaders found healing here, and later showered the hospital with donations of gratitude. Gerard used his good fortune to endow places of rest and shelter, called hospices, along the long, tortuous routes to the Holy Land. And he may even have hired armed knights to protect defenseless pilgrims en route. By 1113, the men of St. John and the women of their sister hospital, St. Mary Magdalene, were recognized by Rome as an exempt religious order, with Gerard as their leader or master. This meant they answered to no one except the Pope and their own conscience. That independence would come to define the very order of the Knights of St. John, and would, some say, determine the future of Europe. Though Gerard was its founder, his successor, Raymond Dupuy, was to shape the order into what would become a legend in the Holy Land and throughout Europe. Raymond, like Gerard, is honored among the blessed of the order. Early on, he officially adopted the 8-pointed cross of Amalfi, which had appeared among the first hospitallers of St. John. It would later become known as the Maltese cross, thanks to the knights who wore it then, as now, on the formal black robe of the hospitallers. But more importantly, to the order's first rule of service to the sick and poor, he added a second: defense of the faith, and under his long rule as Grand Master, the order's focus began to shift to its military members, and the Knights of St. John began to take a much more active role in the Crusades. Men flocked to this new order and its unique idea, a way to serve God in a religious community without removing themselves from the world. The religious brothers of the order were true clerics and lay brothers, but the Knights of St. John were not so much fighting monks as soldiers who had taken solemn vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. The order quickly became essential to the Crusader efforts. Soon the Knights were assigned to hold strategic positions along the narrow 500-mile seacoast kingdom that the Crusaders had established. Thanks to their exceptional military skill and their knowledge of the enemy, the order would hold at one time or another more than 56 fortresses. The Knights would also be responsible for thousands of people who flocked to live and work within the shadow of these massive castles. The Hospitallers were growing in Europe as well. Gifts of land, castles, and income poured in, essential to maintain their military work and to maintain the quality of the Hospital of St. John in Jerusalem. It had grown to massive proportions and must have looked even more impressive than later hospitals built by the order, like this one that still exists on the island of Malta. The Hospitallers' reputation grew, both as healers and as one of the most formidable fighting forces in history. The finest warriors of their age, skilled and valiant in battle. To some they were a sign of hope, and to others, a dreaded enemy. Where there was battle in the Holy Land, there would be Hospitaller Knights. The Hospitallers were also one of the most hated adversaries of the Saracen army. Among Crusaders, the average fighting man who was captured could expect slavery, while nobles were often ransomed for vast sums. But the Hospitallers, like the Templars, could expect no such mercy. In 1187, Saladin, famed for his chivalry and justice, nevertheless revealed just how great the Saracen hatred was. Surveying his prisoners after the Battle of Hattin, the Sultan spotted the telltale white-on-red battle cross of the order, and had every one of the now unarmed Knights of St. John slaughtered on the spot. Yet when he took Jerusalem in 1187, Saladin allowed the hospital to continue to operate and made treaties to allow pilgrims safe passage. There were moments of true chivalry, and often it was the Knights of St. John who exemplified it best. The Crusaders attempted to recover what they had lost, but Europe was growing weary of the cost in men and gold and blood, and hope of victory was fading as the various elements of the Muslim Empire tightened their hold inexorably around the eastern Mediterranean Sea. Finally, the Crusaders found themselves with their backs to the sea, literally. Of the great Crusader strongholds, only Acre remained. Even it had changed hands many times over the long years of crusading. So important were the Knights of St. John in the history of that city, that it was known as St. John d'Acre. When it finally fell for the last time to the Muslim Baybars in 1291, it was at a terrible cost to the Crusaders, and to the Knights themselves. 60,000 Christians were reported killed, and the Crusaders, including the Knights Hospitallers, were reduced to a shred of their former glory. Only 7 Knights of the Order remained alive to lead their ravaged followers onto ships that would carry them away from the place where their legend had been born. They could not know as they watched the shore recede that this was but the first of many voyages into exile. Yet it was also the doorway to a future filled with even greater fame. Reduced to exile on Cyprus with other crusaders, including the Templars, the Knights of St. John immediately focused on the future, first by rebuilding their numbers, and then by forging a new purpose in life. Their legendary exploits in the Holy Land continued to draw recruits from all over Europe, bringing with them even more lands and wealth for the Order's work. They began to organize into langs, or tongues, representing the major lands of their membership. There were 7 original langs, made up of Provence, Auberge, France, England, Germany, Spain, and Portugal. The knights lived communally as they had in the Holy Land, although now each lang began to organize its own auberge or dormitory. The order also began to refine its rules for admission, requiring a stricter definition of nobility and a growing separation between the knights and the sergeants of the order. The military arm had long since taken over control of the order's governance, although priests and monks would continue to be part of its daily life. It had been traditional in the Holy Land and throughout Europe for many members to enter as confrères, men and women of all levels of nobility who made a solemn promise to support the order and uphold the faith. But that was a far cry from what awaited the novice intending to make the order a permanent home. Novice knights were reminded of the order's vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience, and cautioned in the order's ritual of induction not to be led astray by the impression of wealth.
If you see us as well-clothed and riding on great chargers and having everything for our comfort, then you were misled. For when you would desire to eat, it will be necessary for you to fast. And when you would wish to fast, you will have to eat. And when you would desire to sleep, it will be necessary for you to keep watch. And when you wish to stand on watch, it would be necessary for you to sleep. And you will be sent here and there into places that will not please you, and you will have to go there. It will be necessary for you to endure other hardships in the order more than I can describe to you. Are you willing to suffer these things?
In addition to this promise, the professed knight made still another, far more somber one: to die, if need be, for the sake of the order and the faith it served, and in which case, to be assured a seat in heaven. From the beginning of the order, women had been present, serving in the sister hospital of St. Mary Magdalene in Jerusalem, and later in convents across Europe. Like their lay sisters, the confrères, many of the nuns were of noble, even royal lineage, and brought substantial gifts and royal favor with them, just as the male candidates did. This influx of income helped replace the resources lost in the Holy Land, but it did not address the most pressing problem facing the Knights of St. John. What to do now? The Knights needed a new focus, both to channel the energies of their new recruits and to ensure that they did not fall under the same shadow that was about to overwhelm their rivals, the Templars. Since arriving on Cyprus, the order had begun to develop its sea legs. Hospitaller galleys had ferried thousands of pilgrims to the Holy Land, so ships were in their blood. Chance now offered the Knights of St. John the opportunity to make the sea their new battleground. Encouraged by the now nearly extinct Byzantine Empire, the Knights set their sights on the strategic jewel of Rhodes. Sitting only 9 miles from the coast of Turkey, Rhodes was a perfect place from which they could continue their battle against the Muslims by wreaking havoc upon the Turkish fleets that prowled the Aegean and Mediterranean Sea as their empire sought to expand. With its control of the shipping lanes, Rhodes was a perfect site, fertile and lush, with excellent harbors. It was also at that time in the hands of both the Genoese, a seafaring people from northwestern Italy who somehow to be pirates, and the Muslim Turks. The knights arrived on Rhodes in 1306 and began their efforts to take control of the island. It was propitious timing, for the next year, the King of France, driven by jealousy, revenge, and greed, began his systematic destruction of the Knights Templar. The Hospitallers accepted a number of fleeing Templars and their nuns, and inherited some of their wealth. By 1310, the Knights were fully in command of the island of Rhodes, and for the first time, completely autonomous, safely outside the reach of greedy princes, and strategically placed in the Mediterranean to become a key defender of Christian Europe. Rhodes was now the sole heir of Crusader Jerusalem. Unfortunately, most of Rhodes was in ruin. Their first task was to fortify the little island, something the Hospitallers knew how to do very well. Their work would even rebuild the city of Rhodes itself. The walled portion of the Byzantine city, much smaller than the entire ancient city of Rhodes, now became the Order's convent, as they referred to their headquarters. Each lang built a new auberge, although by now, many of the senior members of the Order lived by twos and threes in comfortable houses, leaving the auberge to novices and visitors. The old Byzantine governor's palace was rebuilt to serve as the Grand Master's residence, taking on the grandeur of a sovereign's palace, for the knights were now masters of their own destiny. And of course, they built churches. The Church of Our Lady of Faleramos is not as impressive in size or decoration as some of their later cathedrals, but it bears the unmistakable stamp of the knights' devotion to their religion, a devotion made all the stronger, perhaps, by a sense of failure to hold the Holy Land and the need to prove their faithfulness in the eyes of God. They would have ample opportunity to do so on Rhodes. The city of Rhodes itself was already one of the most impregnable in the Mediterranean, thanks to centuries of conflict and conquest. The town was surrounded by high defensive walls, which the knights reinforced with freestanding towers. Outside, a moat more than 150 feet wide and 200 feet deep was created to trap any enemy attempting to scale its walls. In addition to the island of Rhodes, the knights also claimed and fortified the other smaller islands surrounding them, providing an effective barrier to curtail Muslim navigation of the Mediterranean. But it was their fleet the knights relied on first and foremost. While it boasted only 7 ships, their captains and crews were feared and respected by all. Strict rules governed the galleys. It was hard, dangerous work. We must remember that the knights' strategy of attack was based on boarding the enemy vessel in hand-to-hand combat. It was also the fastest way for a young knight to achieve the required 3 caravans or tours of duty, so necessary to win promotion to higher offices. The Knights of St. John grew ever stronger. By the middle of the 15th century, there were 400 knights on the island with a far larger number of squires, fighting men, and assorted supporters. Their presence on Rhodes did not go unnoticed. There had been constant raids by the Turks since their arrival, and constant forays by the knights, who roved the sea attacking Turkish ships and ports. In 1453, Constantinople, the last Christian bastion in the east, fell to Sultan Mehmed II. Now there was little standing between the Muslim Turks and their ultimate goal, Rome itself. But first, Mehmed declared he would teach a lesson to the little stronghold of knights on Rhodes who dared to stand guard over the sea. On a May morning in 1480, Sentries on duty in the watchtowers of Rhodes saw more than 160 ships carrying 100,000 sons of Islam, intent upon annihilation of the Knights of St. John. On the island, Grand Master Fra Pierre d'Aubusson had at his disposal 600 knights, about 2,000 troops, plus the citizens of Rhodes. The odds were staggering, but all too familiar to the Knights of St. John. Resolutely, d'Aubusson reminded his men of their vows. Then they waited. First, the enemy focused on the city of Rhodes itself, raining down more than 3,500 stone spears, each weighing 1,000 pounds or more. Finally, on July 27th, a part of the city wall was reduced to rubble. Through the breach poured the Turks. But as they had so often in the Holy Land, the knights regrouped and displayed the courage they were famous for. Even the aging d'Aubusson, though seriously wounded, led a group of knights over the walls and after the enemy, finally capturing the banner of the Grand Turk. Their resolution forced the Turks to abandon the battle. Mehmed II died a bitter man and directed his epitaph to acknowledge it with the words, "I intended to conquer Rhodes and to subdue Italy." Thanks to the Knights of St. John, he accomplished neither one. Rhodes and Rome were both safe for the moment. But the tide was shifting in favor of the Turks. In 1520, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent rose to the throne of the Ottoman Turks. He was to become perhaps the most implacable enemy of Christendom and of the Knights Hospitaller. In the summer of 1522, Suleiman's army arrived off Rhodes with hundreds of ships and more men than even Mehmed II had gathered, all intent on finishing the Knights of St. John. The first efforts of the Turk were in vain, although their bombardment of the city surely tested the faith of the defenders. But by September, the enemy finally succeeded in breaching the walls of the English Lang, and once more, Turks poured through the defenses of Rhodes. It appeared all was lost, but the legendary courage of the knights turned the tide, and did so again 20 days later when they forced the Turks back. By that night, more than 15,000 Turks lay dead, but the knights still held the city. By December, it was a desperate situation. The citizens of Rhodes had reached the breaking point. They demanded the knights talk truce. Despite arguments within the order, the Grand Master finally sent a deputation to meet with Suleiman. The Sultan greeted his adversaries with respect. He agreed to the Grand Master's request, and on January 1st, 1523, the Knights of St. John Hospitaller left Rhodes forever. Suleiman himself provided the ships necessary for the evacuation. So great was his admiration of the little band that had held out so long against such great odds. It was a chivalrous gesture he would come to regret. For the next 7 years, the knights found refuge with Pope Adrian VI. They settled in Italy and promptly began to build hospitals, lick their wounds, and re-establish the core of the order. And they began to look for a new home. Charles V of Spain finally offered them the island of Malta. He recognized that the knights could be valuable allies in defending Europe as they had for so many years. Malta was not what they expected. It was barren and unappealing compared to their lush and fertile home on Rhodes. But the knights were not in a position to reject any possibility for a new, permanent location. After a visit by a delegation made up of knights from each lang, they decided it would do. Although more difficult to fortify than Rhodes and lacking some of its charm, the island was, in fact, a perfect strategic base. Malta's openness would prove an excellent defense against sneak attack. And from here, they could continue their God-inspired purpose to keep the Turks from gaining total control of the Mediterranean and achieving their long-sought prize, the conquest of Rome. But the price Charles demanded in return for the island was unthinkable. The knights were to swear allegiance to Spain, and for the French knights, that was unacceptable. More importantly, it might force the knights to break their long vow not to take sides in a war between two Christian nations. So after much internal debate, they brazenly rejected Charles's proposal, and in return offered him the choice of either a holy mass in his name each year, or the yearly gift of a royal falcon on All Saints' Day. Charles's answer was to take the falcon. The knights set sail for Malta in 1530, and once again took up their duty as the foremost outpost standing between Christian Europe and the Turks of the Ottoman Empire. Suleiman was now obsessed with capturing the heart of Christendom, but the European princes continued to bicker with each other as they had through the centuries, rather than readying themselves for the coming onslaught. The knights, however, wasted no time in preparing. Malta was a challenge, for it had little of the natural defenses of Rhodes, and the knights no longer had the income they had once enjoyed. The world had changed in the 16th century, and the growth of Protestantism had severed many ties to their historic holdings in Europe. But the knights had two vital resources left: the determination of their own brethren and the dedication of one of their most illustrious Grand Masters, Frau Jeanne de La Valette. When only 28 years of age, he had lived through the carnage at Rhodes, so he knew well what kind of threat they now faced. He began immediately to make the island as secure as possible, but with the order's usual foresight, he had also taken steps to establish a secret enclave of knights within Suleiman's own capital city of Constantinople. They provided him with a constant stream of reports. So when the Turks arrived on the morning of May 18, 1565, La Valette already knew they were coming. More than 500 ships now faced the little island, filled with the fighting men of Islam, including the famed Janissaries, who, taken in infancy from Christian homes throughout the Turkish Empire, were trained as the Sultan's elite troops. Against them, La Valette had 470 knights, 1,600 Spanish and Italian mercenaries, and about 5,000 Maltese militia. The Turks began their assault on Fort St. Elmo to neutralize the fortress and gain entry into the main harbors. For weeks, they bombarded St. Elmo and eventually began to make assaults upon its walls. Each time, the knights repulsed them, and each night, La Valette would send reinforcements across the harbor and withdraw the wounded to Birgu, where Fort San Angelo stood as the order's main bastion. But the arrival of the notorious corsair, Dragut, put an end to that. As leader of the Turkish force, he set out night patrols and cut off supplies to the beleaguered defenders of St. Elmo. Then he began to attack in earnest. The knights at St. Elmo knew from the beginning their role was critical. Spain was gathering its forces to support Malta, but it would take time. St. Elmo was the key to the defense of Birgu and the future of Malta, and in the minds of many, the future of Christendom itself. The night of June 23rd, On the eve of the feast of St. John, the wounded and bloodied knights at St. Elmo and their supporters gathered for confession and communion. They knew tomorrow they would fulfill their vows once and for all. At dawn, they took their stations. At least two of them so critically wounded they had to be carried to their position on the walls. Dragut made his final onslaught and was himself killed by artillery fire. But his troops swarmed over the fortress. The last battle took place in the doorway of the little chapel. St. Elmo was lost. Even the new commander of the Turkish troops was dismayed at the cost in lives and the prospect of now attacking Fort St. Angelo. Chronicles report that he lamented, "What will the mother cost when the daughter has been purchased at so heavy a price?" To demoralize the defenders, he nailed some of the decapitated bodies of the captured knights to wooden crosses and floated them across the harbor. But the defenders of Fort St. Elmo had bought time for the island. For the next 2 months, the other forts would hold out, thanks to the desperate valor of the order and the courage of the Maltese. In support of the knights, the Maltese risked everything. There would be no surrender, as at Rhodes. Finally, September 7th, as the defenders neared their last gasp, the Spanish fleet broke through the Turkish blockade and landed reinforcements. The feat threw panic into the Turks, who overestimated the Spanish strength. By the time the Muslim commander realized it, his troops were in complete retreat. The great Ottoman Empire had failed to take the little island of Malta, and the joy celebrated in the streets of Malta that night echoes down to us through the centuries. Even today, more than 400 years since the cannons roared and people died, the island still remembers its heroes who sacrificed all for their faith, their ideals, and for their home in the middle of the shining Mediterranean Sea. Each year, this festa, or Feast of St. John, is specifically dedicated to the Knights of Malta. Once again, the Knights were victorious over their old enemies, the Turks. All the centuries of hardship and sacrifice seemed behind them. But history is never so forgiving. For the next few years, the situation was stable enough for Lavalette to focus the order's energies on building instead of destruction. Immediately, the order set to work on a new city that would bear his name, Valletta. In an architectural explosion, Lavalette and the Knights built hospitals, gardens, palaces, and churches. Among the greatest treasures is the conventual Cathedral of St. John. The splendor seems endless. But the cathedral was also the appropriate place for the order to house some of its most precious possessions, the mortal remains of its devoted members.
The floor consists of a number of inlaid marble tablets, which are works of art in their own right. These are tombs of various knights. The floor really depicts the history of Europe of the 17th and 18th centuries, as most of the knights buried here were members of Europe's most illustrious families of the 17th and 18th centuries.
In 1607, the Grand Master was awarded the title of Prince of the Holy Roman Empire, thus ensuring the sovereignty of the order. The Grand Master was elected by his fellow members and served for life with authority over the order and those in it, as well as the people of the order's lands. But a cold breeze from France was about to bring an abrupt halt to the order's activities. The French Revolution was about to claim another victim. In 1789, the order was under suspicion of supporting the crown against the revolutionaries. The charge was true. The order's agent in Paris even loaned King Louis XVI money for his attempted escape. The death of Grand Master Polduc left the order without one of its ablest leaders. The man who replaced him wasn't nearly as capable. Frau Ferdinand von Hompesch was the first German elected to Grand Master. He was also a man with no military experience. He would be remembered as the Grand Master who surrendered Malta to Napoleon with hardly any resistance. Facing a French fleet of more than 500 ships, a delegation of knights met with the future emperor in the early hours of June 12, 1798, to discuss terms. Later that morning, Napoleon arrived to take possession of the island. He had accomplished in days what centuries of Muslim leaders had failed to do. Debate continues even today over why von Hompesch made no attempt to defend the island. But modern hindsight tells us that the order was simply facing a changing world. They could not remain neutral or sovereign amidst rising nationalism and the decline of their old enemies, the Turks. In exile once again, the Knights faced an even worse situation. Throughout the 1800s, the order struggled to retain its fading grasp on life. In a world on the verge of our modern one, its ideals and traditions seemed like quaint and antique concepts. Without land or purpose, the order found itself searching for a place to regroup. It settled finally in Rome in 1834, the most natural of places for an order of the Catholic faith. Once again, it faced an uncertain future. It was not until the second half of the 19th century that the Knights finally began to recover their purpose and reforge a new, more noble order, one that had returned more fully to its roots of service to the sick and the poor. By the turn of the 20th century, it began to reemerge as an organization unique in modern or ancient times, a sovereign nation, the sole purpose of which was the protection of the sick and the poor. They are perhaps the only sovereign state in the world without a country, yet they issue passports, stamps, and coins. The order maintains diplomatic relations with more than 89 nations. Grand Master Fra Andrew Bertie, the first English Grand Master of the order in its history, believes that Gerard's vision must remain the essential purpose of today's Knights.
During its 900 years of existence, we hope that we've been able to help the poor and the sick, which is what we were founded for, and is what we're doing today, and what we hope to go on doing, perhaps for another 900 years. I don't know if we'll manage it. At the moment, we have works in about over 100 countries. That's hospitals, clinics, leprosaria, schools, and first aid corps, and work like that. We are, I hope, a little more than just an ordinary first aid corps. We want to be compassionate. When we take people on a pilgrimage, for instance, we try and keep up with them when they come back. And so that's our mission in this world, and what I hope that we will do.
Despite the richness of its annual ceremonies and the millions of dollars it raises for its charitable activities, the order itself is poor. Each knight and dame who serves supports him or herself, just as the first knights of the order did.
We have an enormous variety of work because we do very little centrally, and every unit, whether it's an association or a priory, has to find out what is needed in the area, and they are responsible for the financing and the management of whatever they do. They are entirely run individually. And therefore, people often ask me, oh, how much are you worth? How much do you give to the sick each year? And I say, look, I don't know. And they think I'm a liar. But a lot of these statistics do not come through our books.
More than 11,000 knights and dames of the order around the world provide fundraising, financial, and personal support for much of the order's work, with the help of tens of thousands of volunteers and affiliates throughout dozens of countries. Even young people are drawn to the values and ideals of the order. Whether these volunteers serve a few hours a month or every day for the rest of their lives, they carry on the legend that began so long ago in Jerusalem.
I always tell our people that it's up to them to see in the faces of the people they help the face of our Lord, because that is their vocation.
For many of us, the Order of Malta is invisible. Yet we might be surprised to realize that some of our friends or neighbors are members of one of the world's oldest orders of chivalry. Joe Pierce, a jeweler from California, serves in his parish every day and aids in raising funds to support the order's work around the world. He doesn't carry a shield or a sword, but he does wear the 8-pointed Maltese cross, the sign of a knight of St. John. And he shares the same sense of justice and devotion that moved the knights of centuries ago.
The oath that we take as a knight is to fight evil and to defend the weak, which has been a pledge from the time of the Crusades to the present time. The future is going to be back in Malta now. The Maltese government gave the knights old Fort St. Angelo. This is the new adventure that we'll be going into that I myself hope to be part of.
We will be using part of the Fort of St. Angelo to have meetings of our presidents or religious exercises or places where people who want to study the history of the order can come and stay. And we might be able eventually to make it a center where we could store material, medicines, medical equipment, water purifiers, so as to be ready to help in any case of a disaster within the Mediterranean area.
Each generation passes to the next its own sense of justice, faith, and honor, and what is right and noble. And each generation reshapes that dream into its own vision of the future. Time has ensured the knights a place in history, and only time will tell how long the ideals that founded them can continue to stir the hearts of others, and how well each succeeding generation can uphold the dream that has been handed to them. We can only hope that 900 years from now, there will still be men and women of such devotion as those who, throughout history, have been known as the Knights of St. John.